Heading: A Forbidden Connection. The station was a marvel of human engineering, floating silently in the void of space. It was called Celestial Horizon, a research outpost on the edge of known space, where humans and aliens worked side by side. Among the crew was Lila, a brilliant human engineer with a knack for solving problems no one else could. Her fiery red hair and sharp green eyes made her stand out, but it was her mind that truly set her apart. She had been assigned to the station 6 months ago, and though she loved her work, she often felt isolated. The aliens were fascinating, but their customs were strange, and she struggled to connect with them. Then there was Kieran, a tall, enigmatic alien from the Zephyrian species. His skin was a deep, shimmering blue, and his eyes glowed like twin stars. He was the station's chief of operations, a position of great respect and responsibility. Kieran was known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect, but there was something about him that made others uneasy. His species was rare, and little was known about their biology or culture. They were private, almost secretive, and Kieran was no exception. Lila first noticed him during a routine systems check. She was in the engineering bay, calibrating the station's power core, when he walked in. His presence was magnetic, and she couldn't help but stare. He moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly, his long limbs flowing like water. When their eyes met, she felt a jolt of electricity, as if something deep inside her had been awakened. "You must be Lila," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," she replied, trying to hide her nervousness. He smiled, revealing sharp, pearly teeth. "Of course. Your work on the power core has been impressive." They talked for a while, discussing the station's systems and the challenges they faced. Lila found herself drawn to him, fascinated by his intelligence and the way he seemed to see right through her. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was as if there was an invisible thread connecting them, pulling her closer to him. As the days turned into weeks, Lila and Kieran found themselves working together more often. They spent long hours in the engineering bay, troubleshooting problems and brainstorming solutions. The more time they spent together, the stronger the connection between them grew. Lila began to notice little things about him, the way his eyes lit up when he was excited, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, the way he always seemed to know what she was thinking. But there was something strange about Kieran, something that Lila couldn't ignore. He never ate in the mess hall with the rest of the crew, and he rarely slept. When she asked him about it, he would change the subject or give vague answers. It was as if he was hiding something, something important. One night, after a particularly long shift, Lila found herself alone with Kieran in the engineering bay. The station was quiet, the only sound the hum of the power core. They were standing close, their shoulders almost touching, and Lila could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Kieran," she said softly, "what are you hiding from me?" He turned to look at her, his glowing eyes piercing hers. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his words carefully. Then he sighed, a sound that was almost human. "Lila," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something you need to know about me. About my species." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. As their fingers intertwined, Lila felt a strange sensation, as if energy was flowing between them. It was warm and comforting, but also intense, almost overwhelming. "We don't consume food like humans do," Kieran explained. "We absorb energy. And not just any energy, we need the energy of other living beings." Lila's eyes widened in shock. "You mean, you feed on people?" "Not in the way you're thinking," he said quickly. "It's not harmful. In fact, it can be pleasurable for both parties. But it's intimate, something we only do with those we trust." Lila's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. It sounded impossible, like something out of a science fiction novel. But the way he was looking at her, the way his touch made her feel, told her it was real. "Are you saying you want to feed on me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kieran nodded, his expression serious. "Only if you're willing. I would never force you, Lila. But I need you to understand that this is a part of who I am." Lila took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, what to think. But one thing was clear, she trusted Kieran. And if this was what he needed, she was willing to give it a try. "Okay," she said finally. "Show me." Kieran's eyes softened, and he pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her. As their bodies pressed together, Lila felt the energy between them intensify, a warm, electric current that seemed to flow through her veins. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a sensation that was both exhilarating and comforting. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Kieran pulled away, his breathing slightly ragged. Lila felt a little lightheaded, but otherwise, she was fine. "How do you feel?" Kieran asked, his voice filled with concern. Lila smiled. "I feel amazing." That was incredible. Kieran smiled back, a look of relief crossing his face. "Thank you, Lila. You have no idea what this means to me." As they stood there, holding each other in the dim light of the engineering bay, Lila realized that something had changed between them. The connection they shared was deeper now, more profound. And though she didn't fully understand it, she knew one thing for certain: she wanted to explore it further. But little did she know, their bond was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Lila. The energy exchange with Kieran had left her feeling both exhilarated and vulnerable. She couldn't stop thinking about the way his touch had sent waves of warmth through her body, the way his eyes had glowed with an intensity that made her heart race. It was as if a door had been opened, and she had stepped into a world she never knew existed. Kieran, too, seemed different. There was a softness in his demeanor, a gentleness that hadn't been there before. He was more attentive, more protective, as if he had claimed her in some unspoken way. But there was also a tension between them, a hunger that neither of them could ignore. They continued to work together, their professional relationship blending seamlessly with their newfound intimacy. But the energy exchanges became more frequent, more intense. Each time, Lila felt herself being drawn deeper into the bond they shared, a connection that went beyond the physical. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of repairs, Lila found herself in Kieran's quarters. The room was spacious, with walls that shimmered like the surface of a calm ocean. The air was filled with a faint, sweet scent that reminded her of the first time they had connected. "You look tired," Kieran said, his voice filled with concern. "Let me help you." He guided her to a low, cushioned platform that served as his bed. Lila sat down, her body sinking into the soft material. Kieran knelt in front of her, his glowing eyes searching hers. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes. I trust you, Kieran." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. As their skin touched, Lila felt the familiar surge of energy, but this time it was different. It was deeper, more intimate, as if Kieran was reaching into the very core of her being. The sensation was overwhelming, a mix of pleasure and vulnerability that left her breathless. She could feel Kieran's hunger, his need, but there was also a tenderness, a care that made her feel safe. When it was over, Lila felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a part of her had been missing and Kieran had filled it. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with wonder. "What is this, Kieran?" she asked softly. "What are we doing to each other?" He smiled, a look of deep affection in his eyes. "We're bonding, Lila. It's something my people do with those they care about. It's rare, and it's powerful." Lila's mind raced as she tried to understand. "But what does it mean? For us, for our future?" Kieran hesitated, his expression serious. "It means that we're connected in a way that can't be broken. It means that I need you, Lila, in a way that I've never needed anyone before." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had never felt so wanted, so needed. But there was also a part of her that was afraid. What did this mean for her life, for her future? As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran reached out and took her hand. "I know this is a lot to take in. But I want you to know that I would never do anything to hurt you. You mean everything to me, Lila." His words were like a balm to her soul, soothing the fears that had begun to creep in. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat was comforting, a reminder that he was real, that this was real. But as they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test the bond they had formed. Heading: a threat from the shadows. The station was on high alert. A gravitational anomaly had been detected on the edge of the system, and the crew was scrambling to prepare for the worst. Lila and Kieran were in the command center, their focus entirely on the task at hand. But even as they worked, the bond between them hummed with an undercurrent of tension. "This doesn't make sense," Lila muttered, staring at the data on the holographic display. "The readings are off the charts. It's like nothing we've ever seen before." Kieran stood beside her, his glowing eyes scanning the information. "It could be a natural phenomenon, but the timing is suspicious." Lila glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "You think someone's behind this?" "I don't know," Kieran admitted. "But we need to be ready for anything." As the hours passed, the anomaly grew stronger, its pull threatening to destabilize the station's orbit. The crew worked tirelessly to reinforce the shields and adjust the station's position, but it was a losing battle. "We need to evacuate," the station's captain announced, his voice grim. "We can't risk staying here any longer." Lila's heart sank. Evacuating the station meant leaving behind everything they had worked for, everything they had built. But she knew the captain was right. They had no choice. As the crew began to prepare for evacuation, Lila found herself alone with Kieran in the engineering bay. The room was eerily quiet, the hum of the power core the only sound. "What happens now?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We leave. We find a new place to continue our work." "And what about us?" Lila asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happens to the bond we've formed?" Kieran reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar surge of energy through her. "The bond is strong, Lila. It will survive this. But we need to be careful. There are forces at play here that we don't fully understand." Lila's mind raced as she tried to process his words. "What are you saying, Kieran? What aren't you telling me?" He hesitated, his glowing eyes filled with conflict. "There are those among my people who would see our bond as a threat. They believe that our kind should remain separate, that we should not form connections with humans." Lila's eyes widened in shock. "You mean there are people who would try to stop us?" Kieran nodded, his expression grim. "Yes. And if they find out about us, they will do everything in their power to tear us apart." A cold fear settled in Lila's chest. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She had come too far, had formed too strong a connection with Kieran, to let it go now. "We'll face it together," she said firmly, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together." Kieran's eyes softened, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "You're stronger than you know, Lila. And together, we can overcome anything." As they stood there, holding each other in the dim light of the engineering bay, Lila felt a surge of hope. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew that she and Kieran would face them together. But little did they know, the storm that was approaching was far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Heading: a fight for survival. The evacuation was chaotic. The station's alarms blared as crew members rushed to the escape pods, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. Lila and Kieran worked side by side, helping to ensure that everyone made it off safely. But even as they focused on the task at hand, the bond between them hummed with an undercurrent of tension. "We need to go," Kieran said, his voice urgent. "The anomaly is getting stronger." Lila nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her bag and followed Kieran to the last remaining escape pod. As they climbed inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The pod launched, its engines roaring as it sped away from the station. Lila watched through the window as the station grew smaller and smaller, until it was nothing more than a speck in the distance. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "To a safe place," Kieran replied, his eyes focused on the controls. "Somewhere we can regroup and figure out our next move." But as they traveled through the void of space, Lila couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. Something was wrong, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Hours passed, and the pod finally entered the atmosphere of a nearby planet. The surface was covered in dense forests and towering mountains, a stark contrast to the cold, metallic environment of the station. As they landed, Lila felt a surge of relief. They were safe, at least for now. But their relief was short-lived. As they stepped out of the pod, they were surrounded by a group of armed figures, their faces hidden behind masks. "Kieran," Lila whispered, her heart racing. "Who are they?" Kieran's expression was grim. "They're from my people. They've come for us." The leader of the group stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "Kieran, you have betrayed our laws by forming a bond with a human. You will come with us, and the bond will be severed." Lila's eyes widened in shock. "No. You can't do this." The leader turned to her, his eyes glowing with a menacing light. "You have no say in this, human. This is a matter for our kind." Kieran stepped forward, his body tense with anger. "You have no right to interfere. The bond is sacred, and it is not for you to decide its fate." The leader's eyes narrowed. "You have left us no choice, Kieran. If you will not come willingly, we will take you by force." Before Kieran could respond, the group attacked. Lila watched in horror as Kieran fought back, his movements swift and precise. But he was outnumbered, and it was clear that he couldn't hold them off forever. "Lila, run," Kieran shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But Lila couldn't leave him. She couldn't abandon him to face this alone. She grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it at one of the attackers, catching them off guard. Kieran took advantage of the distraction, knocking two of the attackers to the ground. But there were still too many of them, and it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed him. As the fight raged on, Lila felt a surge of determination. She couldn't let them take Kieran, couldn't let them destroy the bond they had formed. She reached deep within herself, drawing on the energy that Kieran had shared with her, and unleashed it in a burst of light. The attackers were thrown back, their bodies slamming into the ground. Kieran stared at Lila in shock, his eyes wide with amazement. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Lila shook her head, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I don't know. I couldn't let them take you." Kieran pulled her into a tight embrace, his body shaking with relief. "You're incredible, Lila. But we need to go. They'll be back, and next time they'll be prepared." Lila nodded, her heart still racing. "Where can we go? Where will we be safe?" Kieran's expression was grim. "There's only one place. We need to find the elders of my people. They're the only ones who can help us now." As they set off into the unknown, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. But she also knew that as long as they were together, they could face anything. The journey to find the elders was long and arduous. Lila and Kieran traveled through dense forests, across treacherous mountains, and through winding valleys. The bond between them grew stronger with each step, their connection deepening as they faced the challenges together. But the threat of Kieran's people loomed over them, a constant reminder that they were not yet safe. Finally, after days of travel, they reached a hidden valley, its entrance guarded by towering stone pillars. The air was thick with an ancient energy, and Lila could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her. "This is it," Kieran said, his voice filled with reverence. "The sanctuary of the elders." As they stepped into the valley, they were greeted by a group of Zephyrians, their glowing eyes filled with curiosity and suspicion. The elders, ancient and wise, sat on a raised platform at the center of the valley, their presence commanding respect. "Kieran," one of the elders said, his voice deep and resonant. "You have brought a human to our sanctuary. Explain yourself." Kieran stepped forward, his head held high. "Elders, I have formed a bond with this human, Lila. It is a bond of trust, of love, and of mutual respect. I ask for your blessing and your protection." The elders exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "You know the laws, Kieran. Our kind does not form bonds with humans. It is forbidden." "The laws are outdated," Kieran replied, his voice filled with passion. "The bond I share with Lila is pure and true. It is a bond that transcends species, that defies the limitations of our past. I ask you to see that, to understand that." The elders were silent for a moment, their glowing eyes studying Kieran and Lila. Then one of them, an ancient Zephyrian with silver hair and piercing eyes, spoke. "If what you say is true, then you must prove it. You must undergo the trial of the bond." Lila's heart raced. "What is the trial of the bond?" The elder turned to her, his expression solemn. "It is a test of your connection, of the strength of your bond. If you succeed, you will have our blessing. If you fail, the bond will be severed, and you will be banished from our lands." Kieran nodded, his expression determined. "We accept the trial." The elders led them to a circular platform at the center of the valley, its surface covered in intricate patterns that glowed with a soft light. Lila and Kieran stood in the center, their hands clasped together. "Close your eyes," the elder instructed. "And let the bond guide you." As Lila closed her eyes, she felt a surge of energy, a warmth that spread through her body. She could feel Kieran's presence, his essence, as if they were one. The world around them faded away, leaving only the two of them, connected in a way that was beyond words. The trial began. Visions flashed before Lila's eyes, images of their past, their present, and their future. She saw the challenges they had faced, the moments of joy and pain, the love that had grown between them. She saw the threats that still loomed, the enemies that sought to tear them apart. But through it all, the bond remained strong, a beacon of light in the darkness. Lila held on to that light, letting it guide her through the trial. When the visions finally faded, Lila opened her eyes to find the elders staring at them, their expressions filled with awe. "You have passed the trial," the elder said, his voice filled with respect. "Your bond is true, and it is strong. You have our blessing." Lila felt a surge of relief, her body trembling with exhaustion. Kieran pulled her into a tight embrace, his body shaking with emotion. "We did it," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "We proved our bond." But as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. The enemies that sought to tear them apart were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to destroy the bond they had formed.